Eleanor Davis felt the afternoon sun warm her skin as she walked through the quiet neighborhood. The air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of pine and the earthy dampness from a recent rain. Her roller, Duke, trotted beside her, his steps steady and sure, the weight of his muscles rippling beneath his glossy black fur. She had walked these streets for years, and though the neighborhood had changed, there was a sense of familiarity that made her feel safe. The soft clink of her silver locket, a gift from her late husband, resonated gently against her chest, a constant reminder of the love she had lost but carried with her. As she moved, the weight of her past didn't feel like a burden, but a source of quiet strength. She was Black, and though she had never let her race define her, she was well aware of the silent judgment that followed her wherever she went, like a shadow that never quite lifted. It was something she had come to accept, but not without a lingering bitterness. She was used to the stares, the subtle dismissals. They never fazed her. Until today. The distant hum of a truck, its engine gradually slowing, broke the peace of the moment. Eleanor's instinct told her something was wrong. She glanced over her shoulder, and there it was, a dark pickup truck, creeping along behind her. 4 men sat inside, their faces obscured by the tinted windows, but their eyes were trained on her. She felt the tension rise in her chest. The truck didn't pass. It followed. The men laughed, loud, harsh, uninvited laughter that pierced the silence of the afternoon. She quickened her pace, trying to ignore the creeping unease that was steadily building inside her. Duke's ears pricked up, his body tensing, and the low growl that escaped his throat confirmed her suspicions. The two could feel it. They were being watched. The truck slowed even more, matching her steps. Eleanor tightened her grip on the leash, her knuckles whitening. She could feel Duke's body vibrating with energy, his protective instincts fully awakened. The truck stopped abruptly. The men climbed out, and she could feel their eyes on her, sizing her up as if she were nothing more than an object to be judged. Eleanor didn't stop. She couldn't. She had faced worse in her life than the stares and insults of men who thought themselves entitled. But this was different. The heat of the moment pressed down on her shoulders like a heavy cloak, but she didn't let it show. She kept walking, her steps measured, her eyes fixed ahead. She couldn't afford to show fear. One of the men, the tallest, stepped forward, blocking her path. The others flanked him, their faces half covered in the shadows of their caps. She could feel their gaze on her, heavy and unyielding, like they expected her to shrink back, to be intimidated by their presence. But she wasn't afraid. Not now. She had faced more than enough in her life to know how to stand her ground. Duke's low growl filled the air, a sound that seemed to vibrate from the depths of his chest, sending a shiver down her spine. The tall man's eyes flicked to Duke, then back to Eleanor. He smiled, a cruel, taunting smile. "Nice jewelry," he said, his voice dripping with mockery. His eyes lingered on the locket, the bracelet around her wrist. Eleanor's heart quickened, but she didn't let the panic rise. She didn't flinch, didn't acknowledge the shift in the air. She kept walking. The men didn't move, standing still as if waiting for her to respond, to offer something, to give in. But Eleanor wasn't about to do that. She wasn't some helpless target to be picked apart. Her gaze flicked to Duke. His powerful body was taut, ready to protect, his growl intensifying with every step they took closer. She tightened her grip on the leash, the leather of it biting into her hand. The man took another step forward, his smirk widening as he reached for his wallet. "How about you just hand over the necklace?" he said, his tone casual, as if he were making a simple request. His words were laced with something darker, more dangerous. Eleanor's body tensed. She knew this game all too well, the one where they thought they could take from you because you weren't worth anything. She had seen it, felt it all her life. But she wouldn't give in. She couldn't. This was her life, and no one had the right to take it from her. She stood firm, refusing to back down. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. Duke had already spoken for her. The man's face twisted, frustrated by her refusal to be intimidated. He stepped closer, closer than she would have liked, but Eleanor didn't budge. Her voice, when it came, was steady, unwavering. "You picked the wrong woman to mess with." Her words were simple, but they carried weight. They were a warning. A promise. Duke's growl rumbled through the air, louder now, a clear warning that made the men hesitate. The tension in the street thickened, the quiet of the neighborhood broken by the soft rustling of the trees in the breeze, the distant hum of traffic. The men looked at each other, uncertainty flickering in their eyes, but the tall man wasn't ready to back down. He stepped forward again, his smirk replaced by something colder, more calculating. "We're just admiring," he said, his voice low and dangerous, like he was savoring the power in the moment. But Eleanor wasn't fooled. She had seen enough to know where this was headed. And she wasn't going to let it happen. Not today. Not to her. She took another step forward, the leash held tightly in her hand, her body fully aligned with the strength of the moment. She didn't speak again. She didn't need to. Duke's growl was enough. The tall man's eyes narrowed as his smirk shifted into something more dangerous. His gaze flicked from Eleanor's face to the jewelry around her neck, and then he took another step forward, closing the distance between them. "We don't want any trouble, ma'am," he said, his voice syrupy with false politeness. "But if you don't hand over that necklace and bracelet, we'll have a real problem." The threat in his words hung thick in the air, like smoke that you could taste. Eleanor's grip on Duke's leash tightened, her fingers digging into the worn leather, but her face remained calm, steady. She didn't flinch. Not yet. "Give us the jewelry," the man repeated, this time more forcefully. The other three men stood behind him, their eyes flicking between Eleanor and Duke. There was something predatory in the way they moved, like wolves circling their prey. But Eleanor wasn't going to make it easy for them. She didn't say a word. She just continued to walk forward, slowly, deliberately, her steps unbroken, her eyes forward. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be," the man said. Eleanor could feel the weight of his words, the implied violence in the silence that followed. It would have been easy to give them what they wanted, to hand over the jewelry, but Eleanor wasn't going to let fear rule her. Not now. Not after everything she had been through in her life. She had learned long ago that fear could paralyze you, but it didn't have to. So, she kept walking, forcing her legs to move, even though every instinct in her screamed to run. The man stepped in front of her, blocking her path. She paused, her heart racing but her expression still unchanged. She looked up at him, not with fear, but with defiance. "I'm not giving you anything," she said, her voice low and unwavering. The man's eyes flashed with frustration, and the others shifted nervously, sensing that things were about to escalate. But Eleanor refused to show weakness. She kept her ground, and with one fluid motion she took a step to the side, moving past him, her pace quickening. Duke's growl deepened, a low, rumbling sound that sent chills down her spine. He had always been protective, but today, something about the situation made him more alert than ever. His body was taut, his eyes locked on the men as they stepped closer. Eleanor didn't stop walking. She couldn't afford to show them she was afraid. She had to keep moving to get away from them before it went any further. But the tension was palpable. She could feel the men's eyes on her back, their footsteps echoing in her mind. They weren't going to let her go so easily. She could hear them whispering among themselves, their words too low for her to make out, but she didn't need to hear them to know what was coming. The trap was closing in. She turned the corner, hoping to see one of her neighbors, anyone, who might be able to help. She wasn't sure what she expected, but she had to try. The houses along the street were quiet, the curtains drawn, the doors closed. She spotted Mrs. Jennings across the street, standing on her porch, watering the plants. Eleanor's heart lifted slightly, the faint hope of a helping hand making her think she could escape this situation. She made her way toward her, her eyes locking with Mrs. Jennings. But when the woman looked at her, her gaze faltered, and she quickly turned away, as if pretending she hadn't seen what was happening. Eleanor's chest tightened. No one was coming. She was on her own. The weight of the injustice settled heavily on her shoulders. For a brief moment, she felt the sting of isolation, the bitterness of a world that could look the other way when a woman like her was in danger. She was used to being overlooked, but this was different. This wasn't just neglect. This was complicity. But Eleanor didn't have the luxury of dwelling on it. She took a deep breath, steeling herself for what was next. There would be no more waiting. No more hoping for someone else to step in. It was up to her. She was done with silence, with walking away in fear. She turned back to face the men, her eyes now filled with an unwavering resolve. Duke's growl still rumbled low in his chest, his muscles coiled and ready for action. Eleanor met the tall man's gaze, her voice firm as she spoke. "You want it? You'll have to take it from me." She didn't know if it was the right choice, but it didn't matter anymore. She was ready to fight. Ready to show them that they had picked the wrong person to threaten. The air between them thickened, crackling with tension. The men hesitated for just a moment, caught off guard by the strength in her words. But Eleanor stood her ground. She wasn't going anywhere. This was her stand. This was her moment. And she wasn't going to back down. The man's grip tightened on Eleanor's arm, pulling her toward him with a force that made her stumble, his fingers digging into her skin like a vice. His breath was hot against her ear as he sneered, "Give it to me now," his words laced with aggression, the edge of violence clear in every syllable. She felt the tug on her necklace, the cold metal pressing against her throat as he tried to yank it off. Duke, sensing the rising threat, let out a fierce growl that cut through the tension, his body stiff with warning. In an instant, Duke lunged, his powerful jaws snapping inches from the man's arm, the sound of his bark filling the air like a crack of thunder. The man let out a sharp shout as Duke's teeth grazed his sleeve, and in the chaos that followed, Eleanor stumbled backward, pulling free from the man's grasp. She didn't want this to escalate, didn't want violence, but the situation was rapidly slipping beyond her control. She could see the hesitation in the eyes of the other men, a flicker of doubt at the sight of her unflinching defiance and Duke's raw, unyielding presence. Duke was a wall of muscle, a protector bred for this kind of confrontation, and now, more than ever, Eleanor knew she had him on her side. The tall man, still holding his ground, exchanged a nervous glance with his companions. They could feel the tension thick in the air. This wasn't just an easy grab anymore. They had underestimated her, and now they were staring down the reality of it, an old woman and a dog who were not going to give up. The fear crept in, and though their pride clung to the moment, their resolve wavered. Eleanor stood tall, her heart hammering, but her posture never faltered. She wasn't backing down, no matter how many of them there were, no matter how much stronger they seemed. The men had the numbers, but she had the determination, and that was something they couldn't take from her. One of the men shifted uneasily, looking at his comrades with a mix of frustration and uncertainty. He muttered something under his breath, his shoulders sagging slightly as if the weight of the situation was finally sinking in. "Let's go," he grumbled, turning toward the truck, clearly ready to call it quits. But the tall man wasn't finished. His face twisted in anger as he shoved the man aside, his eyes burning with stubbornness. "Oh, we finish this now," he growled, stepping forward again, determined to get what they came for. That was all Eleanor needed to hear. She squared her shoulders, her breath steady, her eyes locked on his. This was the moment. There would be no turning back now. The final confrontation had begun. The sound of distant sirens sliced through the heavy tension in the air, at first faint but growing louder with each passing second, like a distant storm on the horizon. The men froze, their eyes darting nervously toward the sound, their earlier bravado faltering as they began to realize what was coming. The tall man's face twisted in disbelief, his eyes scanning the empty street for the source of the noise, his body stiff with sudden panic. The others shared the same nervous glance, their shoulders tensing as the wail of the sirens grew closer, the unmistakable sound of police lights flashing in the distance. Panic began to seep in, their faces drained of color as they looked from Eleanor to the approaching noise, their confident, threatening demeanor crumbling. It was as if the world had suddenly shifted beneath them, and they were no longer in control. One of the men swore under his breath, his voice shaky, the first cracks in their composure showing. "Damn, we've got to go," he hissed, looking back at the truck. But the leader, still clinging to the idea of taking what he came for, shook his head sharply, his fists clenching at his sides. "Not yet. We're not done here," he growled. Eleanor's eyes flicked toward the men, noting their faltering resolve as the sirens drew nearer. She knew this was her chance. With the men distracted by the approaching officers, she saw an opening. She tugged at Duke's leash, the powerful dog already attuned to her movements, and with a sharp command, sent him charging forward. Duke was a blur of muscle and speed as he lunged toward one of the man closest to him, who had been eyeing her jewelry. The man yelped as Duke's jaws closed around his arm, the dog's powerful grip pulling him backward, causing him to stumble and crash to the pavement. Duke held the man down with a growl, pinning him to the ground, his teeth bared in warning. The man struggled beneath him, panic rising in his throat as he tried to wriggle free, but Duke's weight was too much, and the dog remained steadfast, keeping him immobilized. Eleanor's heart raced as she watched the scene unfold, her mind racing with the realization that she had taken control of the situation, but her hands were steady. The sirens were deafening now, the sound of them reverberating through the street as 2 patrol cars screeched to a halt at the curb, their lights flashing brightly against the afternoon sky. Officers jumped out, their hands resting near their holsters, eyes quickly assessing the scene. The leader of the group hesitated, caught between running and staying to confront Eleanor, but the sight of Duke holding one of his own down, and the arrival of the police, made him think twice. The officers moved swiftly, their actions practiced, and within moments, the man pinned by Duke was dragged roughly to his feet, still protesting, though it was clear that his resistance was futile. One officer approached Eleanor, his voice calm but firm. "Ma'am, are you all right?" he asked, his eyes briefly scanning the scene. Eleanor nodded, her gaze steady, her heart still pounding in her chest, but she felt a wave of relief wash over her. "I'm fine," she replied, her voice unwavering. "He's the one you want." The officer nodded, signaling to his partner to secure the man. As the officers took control of the situation, Eleanor stood tall, watching as the man was cuffed and led to one of the patrol cars. The sound of the sirens was still ringing in her ears, but there was a quiet satisfaction now, knowing that justice was starting to take its course. But as the police moved in and began their investigation, the streets that had once felt so familiar now felt strange, as if the very air had shifted. As the officers spoke to her and took her statement, some of the neighbors began to emerge from their homes, cautiously peering from behind curtains and doorways. Eleanor could feel their eyes on her, their stares sharp and disapproving. It was subtle at first, an uncomfortable silence, a quick glance that lingered just a second too long. And then, one of the older women, Mrs. Thompson, stepped forward, her expression tight with disapproval. "What did you think you were doing?" she asked, her voice low, but with a distinct edge of judgment. "This was a quiet neighborhood until you brought the trouble here." Eleanor's eyes met hers, and she felt the sting of those words. It wasn't the first time she had been made to feel like an outsider in her own community, but this time it hit harder, a reminder of the indifference she had often faced. Mrs. Thompson wasn't the only one to speak up. Another neighbor, Mr. Harper, shook his head as he muttered something under his breath, his gaze heavy with disappointment. "All this drama, all this mess. Is it really worth it?" Eleanor felt the weight of their judgment, their words like stones, sinking deeper into her chest. But she didn't let them see how much it hurt. She stood her ground, her chin lifted, her gaze steady. She wasn't going to apologize. She wasn't going to back down. "I did what needed to be done," she said, her voice steady despite the ache in her heart. "This was about more than just me. It was about what's right." The police officers finished up their statements and moved the suspect into the car, ready to take him in. As the car pulled away, Eleanor stood on the curb, watching the flashing lights disappear into the distance. The air was quieter now, but the weight of what had just happened hung in the air, a reminder that the fight for justice wasn't easy. But Eleanor was resolute. She had done what was necessary, and despite the judgment of her neighbors, despite the uncomfortable silence that lingered, she knew she would continue to stand for what was right. The truth was on her side, and she wasn't going to let anyone take that away. The days after the incident blurred into one another, and soon, the weight of what had transpired began to settle on Eleanor's shoulders. The police investigation had begun, and officers had collected the evidence, piecing together the fragments of the altercation. Eleanor had already provided her statement, but now she had to prepare for what was next: the court. The realization that she would have to stand before a judge and possibly a jury To recount the events and relive the tension of that afternoon sent a wave of unease through her. Still, she was resolute. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about something bigger. She found herself in the office of her attorney, a middle-aged man named Mr. Jenkins, whose calm demeanor and no-nonsense approach had quickly earned her trust. "We've got a strong case," he assured her as he sat across from her, reviewing the evidence. "The video footage, your testimony, and Duke's actions are all key. We'll make sure these men are held accountable." Eleanor nodded, her eyes fixed on the documents in front of her. She felt a surge of gratitude toward him, but there was also an underlying tension. The pressure was mounting, and she wasn't sure how much longer she could keep up the facade of calm. Outside the office, people were already starting to talk. Eleanor could feel the eyes of her neighbors on her as she walked through the streets, their whispered conversations following her wherever she went. Some nodded in recognition, but others turned away, the judgment in their eyes cutting deeper than any words could. She heard snippets of conversation, quiet criticisms about how she had handled the situation, about how she had made a spectacle of herself. It stung, but she didn't let it show. She couldn't afford to be swayed by their opinions. She had done what she had to do. Yet, as the days dragged on, the weight of her actions grew heavier. Eleanor realized that this was no longer just about one violent encounter in her neighborhood. It had become a battle for something more. The fight for respect, for the acknowledgement that her life, her dignity, and her safety mattered. She wasn't just fighting for herself, she was fighting for every person who had been overlooked, dismissed, or dehumanized. Her thoughts returned to the day of the confrontation, to the way the men had looked at her, how they had believed they could intimidate her because she was an older black woman. That belief, so deeply ingrained in their minds, was what she was up against now. The fight was bigger than just this case. It was about challenging those assumptions, showing that no one had the right to treat her, or anyone, like that. The prosecutor, a woman named Jessica Nguyen, had been working tirelessly on the case, pulling together all the evidence. Eleanor had met with her a few times, and each conversation had bolstered her confidence in the case's direction. "We've got them," Jessica had told her, her voice firm as she outlined the charges. "The video from the neighbor's security camera, the witness accounts, and your testimony. It's all building a solid case. These men won't get away with this." Eleanor appreciated Jessica's optimism, but she couldn't shake the feeling that the real battle had only just begun. The thought of sitting in that courtroom, under the harsh scrutiny of strangers, made her stomach churn. She knew it wouldn't be easy. They would try to discredit her, twist her words, make her feel small. But she couldn't back down now. She had already taken the first step, and there was no turning back. As the day of the trial drew closer, Eleanor found herself standing in front of the mirror, adjusting her blouse, her fingers trembling slightly. She was ready, or at least she had to be. She knew that what came next would not only shape her future but would also send a message to those who believed they could silence her. She took a deep breath, her reflections staring back at her, and for the first time in a long while, she saw the strength in her own eyes. The courtroom would be the next battlefield. She wasn't afraid anymore. The courtroom was silent as Eleanor stepped onto the witness stand, her heart pounding in her chest, the weight of all that had happened resting heavily on her shoulders. She adjusted her glasses, her fingers brushing the silver locket around her neck for comfort, and took a deep breath, trying to steady the nerves that threatened to overtake her. The courtroom was filled with unfamiliar faces, judges, jurors, lawyers, all focused on her, and she could feel their eyes piercing into her, trying to pull out her every thought, every hesitation. But she wasn't going to give them the satisfaction. Not today. With a steady voice, Eleanor began recounting the events of that day. Her words came slowly at first, but as she spoke, the memories became clearer, sharper. She described the heat of the afternoon, the quiet street she had walked down for years, and how it all shifted the moment the truck had pulled up behind her. She spoke of the men's taunts, how their laughter had sliced through the peace of the neighborhood, how their words had cut deeper than she ever thought possible. As she continued, her voice grew more confident, the pain of that day surfacing with every word, but also the strength that had carried her through it. She told the jury about Duke, her loyal protector, and how he had instinctively moved to defend her, standing between her and the men who had sought to take what wasn't theirs. She described the panic in their eyes as they saw the power in her dog, the realization that they were no longer in control of the situation. She didn't leave out a single detail: how they had tried to intimidate her, how they had underestimated her, and how she refused to let them take what was hers. The defense attorneys tried to discredit her, attempting to twist her words into something less than what they were, but Eleanor's testimony stood firm, unyielding. They questioned her actions, suggesting that perhaps she had provoked the situation, that she had made it worse than it had to be. But Eleanor didn't flinch. She had prepared herself for this. She had known that they would try to make her the villain in her own story. But she was ready. She wasn't going to let them make her doubt herself. Then came the moment that silenced them all: the video. The prosecutor, Jessica Nguyen, presented the footage from the security camera, the grainy images flashing up on the large screen for all to see. The jury watched in stunned silence as the truck slowed, the men getting out, their movements captured in stark detail. They saw how the men had circled her, how they had threatened her, how they had tried to take her jewelry, and how Duke had intervened, his presence alone enough to make them hesitate. The footage didn't lie. It told the truth without any words needed. It was clear who the aggressors were. The defense attempted to argue that the men hadn't meant any harm, that it was all a misunderstanding, but the evidence was undeniable. The video showed their intent clearly, and with it, the prosecution's case grew stronger. Jessica presented more evidence, additional witnesses who had seen the men around the neighborhood, confirming that they had been in the area with malicious intent long before they confronted Eleanor. Each new piece of evidence added weight to the case, and the defense's attempts to deflect began to crumble. Eleanor could feel the tension in the room building, the air thick with anticipation, but she didn't let it shake her. She stood tall, her back straight, her eyes unwavering as she listened to the arguments. The prosecution's case was airtight. Her own testimony had been strong, and the video had been the final nail in the coffin. The defense could try to deny it, but the truth was out there, and the jury could see it clearly. The judge gave the signal to the jury, and they began their deliberations. Eleanor sat in her seat, her fingers twisting the fabric of her skirt nervously, but she didn't let herself succumb to doubt. She had done everything she could. The rest was out of her hands. As the minutes dragged on, she found herself on the edge of her seat, the suspense building with each passing second. The weight of it all, of what had happened, of the battle she had fought, hung in the air, thick and heavy. And then, at last, the jury returned, and with them, the verdict. Eleanor felt her breath catch in her throat. She wasn't sure what to expect, but she was ready. The moment of truth had arrived. The trial had reached a pivotal point when M, one of the men involved in the robbery, made the surprising decision to cooperate with the prosecution in exchange for a potentially lighter sentence. Eleanor hadn't expected this turn of events. The man who had once stood against her, one of the four who had threatened her life, was now ready to speak. He seemed to shrink before the courtroom, a far cry from the arrogant figure who had demanded her jewelry weeks before. His once defiant posture had dissolved into one of submission as he sat in the witness chair, his voice hesitant as he began to explain his role in the crime. "We thought it'd be easy," M confessed, his voice barely audible, as he shifted uncomfortably under the spotlight of the courtroom. "We thought she'd be an easy target. An old lady walking alone in the neighborhood. We thought no one would care. Just grab her stuff and no one would notice." His words stung. To him, she had been nothing more than an object, someone so easy to take advantage of because of her age and skin color. Eleanor's fingers tightened on the armrest, the rage that bubbled inside her threatening to overtake her composure. But she forced herself to remain still, to listen. M continued, his eyes flicking to the floor, clearly avoiding her gaze. "Tanner, he said no one would stop us. He said she wouldn't fight back. We weren't planning on hurting her. We just wanted to scare her into giving us what we wanted." Each word was like a blow, each sentence reinforcing the cruel reality that they had underestimated her, thought her weaker than she really was. She fought to keep the emotion from overtaking her. She was angry, yes, but more than that, she was determined. She couldn't let this man's cowardice or the others' assumptions stand. This was the moment she had been preparing for. The weight of their misjudgment, the underestimation of her strength, had fueled this fight for so long, and it wasn't over. M's confession, though painful, was only part of the story. He continued to explain how he and the others had planned the robbery, how they had followed her, watched her for days, believing that she was a perfect target. "We thought she wouldn't fight back. We were wrong." Those words hit Eleanor harder than she expected. He admitted it. He had seen her as weak, as someone who would simply bow to their threats. She wanted to feel victorious, to relish in the validation of her strength, but it didn't feel like that. Not now. She sat there, her heart pounding, knowing the truth of their intentions, but wondering if she should feel pity for this man who was now pleading for mercy. He was just another victim of a system that had failed him long before he made the choice to threaten her. The courtroom felt suffocating as she wrestled with her thoughts. Should she show him mercy? Should she allow his cooperation to lessen the severity of his punishment, knowing that he had chosen to speak out against his friends? It wasn't an easy decision. The temptation to show kindness to someone who was so clearly lost in his path was there, but Eleanor knew deep down that this wasn't about mercy. It was about justice. Justice for herself, for Duke, for the dignity they had all tried to strip away from her. She had fought for this moment, had risked everything to bring these men to justice, and she couldn't allow her empathy for one man to weaken the resolve she had spent weeks building. She had seen the consequences of their actions. She had been the target of their violence, and she knew that, despite his cooperation, M had still been a part of something far greater. Eleanor couldn't afford to let his admission of guilt sway her. The line had to be drawn here. "I'm not forgiving you," she said quietly, her voice steady but firm. "You chose this path. You thought I was weak, and you thought you could walk away without consequences. That's not how this works." M's face crumpled, his shoulders slumping as he nodded, accepting the reality of his fate. The prosecutor, Jessica Nguyen, had done her job. She had gathered the evidence, and now, with M's confession, the case was airtight. The other three men, still sitting in the defendant's chair, shifted nervously as the full weight of the evidence fell upon them. Eleanor didn't look at them. She didn't need to. She had already won. Justice was coming. The courtroom was filled with a tense silence as the judge read the final verdict. Eleanor sat still, her heart hammering in her chest as the words sank in, confirming what she had fought so hard for. Each of the men who had threatened her, who had thought they could intimidate her, would now pay the price for their actions. Guilty on all charges, the judge declared, his voice firm and unwavering. The men, once so brash, so sure of their power, were now reduced to a pitiful sight, their faces drained of color as the gravity of the situation took hold. Tanner, Foley, and Mercer would serve long sentences, each convicted of attempted robbery, assault, and intimidation, with no possibility of early release. M, who had cooperated with the prosecution, would receive a lighter sentence, but even his reduced punishment felt like a small victory. For Eleanor, it was a moment of justice, but the sense of triumph was not as sweet as she had imagined. As she stood to leave the courtroom, her mind kept returning to the faces of the men as they were escorted out in handcuffs, the weight of their guilt hanging over them, yet the reality of what they had done to her, and to others like her, felt heavier than the verdict itself. Outside, as she made her way through the courthouse steps, a flood of conflicting emotions washed over her. On one hand, she had won. The justice she had sought for herself had been served, but on the other hand, there was an emptiness, a quiet sorrow that tugged at her heart. The faces of the neighbors who had once looked away now seemed different, their expressions hesitant and unsure. Some of them offered quick nods or distant smiles, as though they were now acknowledging her presence in a way they hadn't before. Others, though, couldn't meet her eyes, their discomfort palpable as they avoided her gaze or whispered behind closed doors. It was as though they weren't sure where they stood anymore, unsure if they could reconcile the woman they thought they knew with the one who had stood up and fought back. The tension in the neighborhood had shifted, and Eleanor could feel the change in the air. It was subtle but undeniable. The respect she had always longed for was there, but so was a lingering unease, a sense that she was somehow different in their eyes. Her actions had exposed a truth that many would rather have ignored. She had brought attention to the flaws in their own thinking, in their own complacency, and that discomfort lingered. Eleanor knew that, for many of them, she would never be fully accepted again, no matter how much she had earned their respect. She had shattered their comfortable illusions of what was right and wrong, and in doing so, she had made them confront their own biases. But there was something more, something deeper that she had gained through all of this. It wasn't just the victory in court, or the satisfaction of seeing those men pay for what they had done. It was the realization that her fight had never just been about her. It had been about confronting the deep-seated prejudices that still existed in her community, in society as a whole. The men who had attacked her had seen her as weak, as someone to be overlooked, someone whose life didn't matter. But in the end, she had shown them, shown all of them, that no one could define her that way. Her victory wasn't just over those criminals. It was over the fear, the preconceptions, and the bias that had allowed people like them to thrive unchecked. As she stood in front of her house later that evening, Duke by her side, Eleanor looked out at the neighborhood she had fought so hard for. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the street, and for the first time in a long while, she felt a sense of peace. She had done what was right, even when it was hard, even when it meant standing alone. And now, as people began to whisper her name with newfound respect, Eleanor knew that her work was far from done. She wasn't going to stop here. She wasn't going to let her victory be the end of her fight. There were others out there, others who needed the same courage, the same strength to stand up and be heard. Eleanor wasn't finished. Not by a long shot. She had broken the silence, and now, she was ready to fight for what was right, no matter how difficult it might be. After the trial, Eleanor's life shifted in ways she could never have imagined. Her victory in the courtroom had made her a symbol of justice, a woman who refused to be silenced by fear or prejudice. Word of her courage spread like wildfire, and soon, her story became the subject of public discussion, sparking conversations not only about the crime itself but about the deeper issues of race and violence that still plagued her community. The media coverage was intense, with reporters and journalists eager to capture every detail of the case, from the moment the men had first confronted her to the trial that followed. Eleanor's face appeared on television screens, her name trending on social media, and her story was dissected by pundits, activists, and citizens alike. The debates were heated, with some hailing her as a hero, a woman who had stood up for what was right, while others questioned the need for such a dramatic confrontation, suggesting that it had escalated the situation unnecessarily. The discussions quickly turned to larger issues, as the incident became a reflection of the systemic problems of violence and racism that still festered beneath the surface of society. People argued about whether Eleanor's experience was an isolated case or a symptom of something much larger. The spotlight on her case brought the uncomfortable truths to the surface, forcing the community to confront its own prejudices and the uncomfortable reality that not everyone was seen as equal in the eyes of the law. Meanwhile, the men who had attacked her continued to defend their actions, their statements growing more and more unconvincing as time passed. Tanner, the ringleader, gave interviews to the media, offering half-hearted apologies, claiming that they had been misguided and that they hadn't meant for things to escalate as they did. But the public was no longer buying their excuses. The video footage of their actions, their threats, and their attempt to rob her left little room for justification. Their apologies fell flat, and their continued attempts to explain away their behavior only seemed to highlight their guilt. The more they spoke, the more their credibility crumbled. Eleanor had already made her peace with the outcome. She had stood up to them in the courtroom, and now the world could see them for who they truly were, cowards who thought they could intimidate an older woman simply because they believed she was weak. But for Eleanor, the battle wasn't over. While the trial had been a victory, she knew that her fight had to continue. She had become a symbol, yes, but that also meant she had a responsibility to do more, to ensure that her story wasn't just a moment of fleeting attention but a catalyst for change. The conversations surrounding her case had revealed a deeper issue, an issue that couldn't be swept under the rug. She began working with local activists, speaking at rallies, and meeting with community leaders to discuss ways to combat the racism and violence that had threatened her life. She used her newfound platform to raise awareness, to push for policy changes, and to call for justice not only for herself but for others who had been silenced by fear. It was exhausting work, and the toll it took on her was apparent, But Eleanor refused to back down. She had seen firsthand the power of standing up, of demanding to be heard, and she wasn't going to let that power fade into the background. Every step she took, every conversation she had, brought her closer to the goal of creating a community where people of all backgrounds felt safe, respected, and equal. As the months passed, Eleanor's influence grew. She became a beacon of hope for many, a reminder that one person, standing alone, could make a difference. Her story was no longer just about one woman and a group of men who had tried to hurt her. It was about every person who had ever felt marginalized, dismissed, or overlooked. The lessons learned from her ordeal rippled through the community, igniting conversations and actions that had the potential to change the future. Eleanor's fight for justice, for equality, and for respect didn't end with her victory in the courtroom. It was just the beginning. Her story remained a powerful lesson to everyone who heard it, proof that even in the face of adversity, courage and determination could bring about change. Eleanor stood in the doorway of her home, looking out over the neighborhood she had walked through for years. The world outside had changed, but in many ways it was the same. The streets were familiar, the trees that lined the road still swayed in the wind, and the sun set just as it always had. Yet, everything felt different now. The fight for justice she had waged had left its mark on her, transforming her not just in the eyes of others but deep within herself. The victories, the struggles, and the battles had shaped her into someone stronger, someone who understood the weight of what it meant to truly stand up for what was right. It wasn't just about winning in the courtroom or securing a conviction. It was about the internal journey, the growth that came with the courage to face what others might shy away from. Eleanor had learned the true meaning of resilience, of fighting not for the applause but for the quiet satisfaction of knowing she had done the right thing, no matter the cost. Her life, though far from perfect, was now filled with purpose in a way it hadn't been before. She had taken something that could have broken her and turned it into something powerful. She was not just surviving, she was thriving. With this new sense of clarity, Eleanor felt the need to channel her strength into something that could help others. She had never wanted to be a symbol, but now she realized that her story could be used to empower those who felt powerless, to give a voice to those who had been silenced. And so, she founded an organization focused on supporting women and victims of violence, a place where they could find help, guidance, and, most importantly, solidarity. It wasn't easy, the work was grueling, and there were times when she wondered if she was making a difference at all. But then she would remember the faces of those who had been helped, the survivors who had found a path forward because of the foundation she had built. She had created something that mattered, something that could change lives. As her organization grew, so did the impact of her message. People began to look to Eleanor not just as a victim, but as a leader, someone who had taken her pain and turned it into power. She spoke at rallies, attended meetings, and made sure that her voice was heard. Her journey had inspired many, and with each person who came forward to share their own story, Eleanor knew that her fight had ignited a spark. She had become a beacon for others who had been overlooked, who had been told their voices didn't matter. They were listening to her now, and they were ready to stand beside her. Every morning, Eleanor and Duke continued their walks through the neighborhood, but now, the streets held a different meaning. The once familiar path was now a symbol of her journey, a constant reminder of how far she had come and what she had accomplished. With every step, she found peace in the rhythm of the world around her. The simple act of walking no longer felt mundane. It was a reflection of her new life, a life built on strength, resilience, and purpose. Duke, ever by her side, walked with the same steadiness, his body strong and sure, just as it had been on that fateful day. The bond between them had deepened in ways Eleanor hadn't imagined. They had been through so much together, and now, with each passing day, they were more connected than ever before. As they walked, Eleanor reflected on the journey that had led her here. She thought about the fight for justice, the doubts she had wrestled with, and the people who had tried to silence her. She thought about the victories, the losses, and the lessons she had learned. But most of all, she thought about the future. She knew that the fight was far from over. There were still so many battles to be fought, so many voices to be heard. But Eleanor no longer felt uncertain. She had found the strength within herself, and she knew that no matter what came next, she was ready. She had already fought the hardest battle, against herself, and had come out stronger. The world had seen what she was capable of, and now she would continue to stand tall, to fight for what was right, and to help those who needed it most. With Duke by her side and the lessons of her journey guiding her, Eleanor felt a deep sense of peace settle within her. She knew that her fight had made a difference, and that, in the end, was all that mattered.